In August of 1999, I came home on the last day of school to some seriously unwanted news. I was going to spend my summer break at Uncle Michael's farm. It hit me like a punch in the gut. I had dreams of lazy days at the beach, but now I'd be trading the salty ocean breeze for the harsh smell of dirt and animals. Uncle Michael was a recluse, marked by grief. Aunt Sonia had died suddenly the previous summer, and since then, the farm, once his pride, had fallen into complete neglect. He was never much of a talker, and after my aunt's death he became even colder and more distant. My mom had no choice but to decide I should go help him. She believed that, even if he didn't ask, he needed it. I, on the other hand, saw it as nothing but a punishment. First few days on the farm were exhausting. Uncle Michael had me working from sunrise to sunset. My arms and legs ached, and my body was marked by sunburns and insect bites. The environment was suffocating, both physically and mentally. The house, an old, poorly kept mansion, had a gloomy atmosphere. Moldy wallpapered walls and windows that creaked like they were groaning at night. The place that unsettled me the most was a room at the end of the hallway, always locked. Uncle Michael never said much about it, just mentioned in passing that it was an old office, and I shouldn't worry about it. But each day my curiosity grew. That summer, the nights were especially long and dark, adding to the isolation. The nights were the worst when silence took over, and only the distant sound of wind across the fields broke the monotony. But on one night, something felt different. After an especially tiring day, when Uncle Michael complained of arthritis pain and went to bed early, I found myself alone in the living room, with nothing to do. The silence of the house seemed to echo my thoughts back to me, stirring my curiosity about the locked room. Finally, the temptation was stronger than my caution. I waited until I was sure Uncle Michael was sound asleep. Then I went to his coat, hanging by the door, and reached into one of the pockets. I felt the cold touch of keys and pulled them out, trying not to make a sound. I took a deep breath, my heart racing with adrenaline, and headed to the end of the hallway. Keys slid into the lock with a soft click, and the door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of mold and dust. The room was dark, with only a small window letting in a sliver of moonlight. With hesitant steps, I entered. First, the room seemed ordinary, just old and dusty, with furniture worn by time. A desk, a cracked leather chair, rotting curtains, and an almost empty bookshelf. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, something in the corner of the room caught my attention. A small chest, discreetly hidden under a blanket of dust. My curiosity was at its peak. I knelt beside the chest and with trembling hands lifted the lid. The smell of damp and old wood filled the air as I opened it, revealing its content. A pile of yellowed papers and some old photographs. I leaned closer to the papers, noticing they were letters. I started to flip through them and quickly realized they weren't normal correspondence. The letters, written in a firm hand, described some sort of diary of horrific activities. At first, the words were vague, mentioning studies and experiments. But as I read more, the dark nature of these experiments became clear. They were accounts of torture, of deliberate suffering inflicted on victims, described only as patients. Terror began to creep in as I realized the reality of those accounts. The descriptions weren't from a doctor or scientist, but from a sadist. Each line detailed the victim's agony with disturbing precision. I started to feel sick but couldn't stop reading. Something inside me wanted to know how far it went, even though another part of me screamed to stop and run. Then I found the photos. My fingers trembled as I turned the next piece of paper, and a dozen black and white photos slipped out, scattering across the floor. Each image showed faces of people, their expressions twisted with fear and pain. I recognized one of the people as Aunt Sonia, but what I saw in the photo left me completely frozen. The photo showed my Aunt Sonia, not with the sweet smile I remembered, but with an expression of pure terror. She was tied up, her eyes wide, and her mouth open in a silent scream. There was no doubt. My aunt, the same woman I knew as kind and loving, had been one of the victims in the twisted experiments my uncle documented so meticulously. Following photos were even worse. In one, a woman I didn't recognize was covered in blood, her fingers twisted into an unnatural position, as if they had been deliberately broken. Another showed a man, his expression blank, with deep scars covering his body. Horror overtook me. The chest seemed like a tomb holding my uncle's darkest secrets, and I had just uncovered them. With trembling hands, I put the photos back in the chest and closed the lid. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to run, to get out of there and never look back. But at the same time, I felt like I needed to confront the truth. I needed to know how far this went. With my heart pounding violently, I rummaged through the chest again and found something that made me freeze. There was a final layer of items at the bottom of the chest, covered by a dirty, faded cloth. When I removed it, I saw the metallic glint of dozens of wedding rings. Each one was engraved with a date and a name, and some still had dark stains that I knew, instinctively, were blood. Why did my uncle keep these rings? What did these dates mean? My stomach churned, and my body felt paralyzed by a paralyzing fear. I tried to think of some explanation, anything that made sense, but the reality was too terrifying to ignore. These rings, these dates, were trophies of death, memories of a sick ritual my uncle performed with each of his victims. The sound of footsteps in the hallway shattered the suffocating silence of the room. My muscles tensed, and I felt panic crawl up my spine. Uncle Michael was awake. If he caught me there, I knew there would be no escape. He would do to me what he did to the others, and no one would ever know what happened to me. In a desperate impulse, I turned off the flashlight and dove behind the bed, trying to stifle my heavy breathing. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could hear the key turning in the room's door. The fear was almost tangible. Cold grip that took over me entirely. The door creaked open, and the hallway light spilled into the room where I was hiding. I didn't dare blink, my eyes fixed on the pair of boots now standing in the middle of the room. Uncle Michael stepped inside, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. He stood there for a moment, as if trying to sense something, as if he knew I was there, couldn't see me. Sweat trickled down my forehead, and every second that passed was torture. He took another step and bent down to pick up something I couldn't see. That's when I realized the chest was slightly out of place. I had moved it when I opened it, and Uncle Michael must have noticed. My heart almost stopped as he slowly lifted the chest lid, letting the sound of the wood echo through the room. The hallway light revealed the rings and blood-stained photos, and I heard a heavy sigh escape my uncle's lips. Uncle Michael stood there in silence, staring at the contents of the chest as if reliving each of the grim memories associated with those objects. The air seemed to grow heavier, and I felt as if the darkness of the room was slowly swallowing me. Fear paralyzed me, and the only thing I could do was watch, helpless, as my uncle bent even lower, reaching into the chest and pulling out one of the photos. He held the picture for a few moments, and I could see his shoulders tremble slightly. I thought he was crying, but when he stood up and turned his face toward the light, I saw an expression I'll never forget. It wasn't sadness or regret. It was a smile of sick satisfaction, as if he was proud of what he saw. The sight of that smile made me realize just how deeply disturbed my uncle was. He was the monster I never imagined could exist so close to me, and I was alone with him, in that isolated house, with no one to help me. For a moment, I considered the possibility that he knew I was there, hiding in the shadows, and was just toying with me, prolonging the terror before acting. But instead of looking for me, he placed the photo back in the chest, closed the lid, and let out a deep sigh, as if he was satisfied with what he had done. Then he slowly stood up and walked toward the door. Each step he took echoed like a drumbeat in my chest. When he finally left the room, the hallway light turned off, plunging everything back into darkness. I remained still, listening to his footsteps fade into the distance. Only when absolute silence returned did I dare to breathe again. But I knew I wasn't safe. He could come back at any moment, and I couldn't risk being caught there. With slow, silent movements, I got up from my hiding spot behind the bed. My mind was racing, desperately trying to come up with a plan to escape. I crossed the dark room with extreme caution. Each creak of the floorboards was a stab of anxiety in my chest. The hallway was shrouded in dense shadows, and every step I took seemed to echo in my head like an alarm. I had to get out of there, but the only exit was at the end of the hallway, and my uncle's room was in the opposite direction. Knowing I had no choice, I began to tiptoe, praying that he wouldn't come out of his room at that moment. As I neared the stairs, I heard a low sound coming from his room. It was a murmur, almost as if he was talking to someone. I stopped, trying to make out what he was saying. The words were unintelligible. There was something disturbing about it, something that told me I needed to get out of that house as quickly as possible. I descended the stairs with my heart in my throat. Each step felt like it was leading me into a trap. When I finally reached the ground floor, I ran to the front door and turned the handle. To my horror, the door was locked. I hadn't heard Uncle Michael lock it, but now it was clear that he didn't intend to let me leave so easily. Panic took over. I ran to the kitchen, trying to find some other way out. All the windows were locked, and the old curtains blocked out the moonlight. I could hear the muffled sound of the wind outside, calling me, inviting me to flee. But like a rat caught in a trap, I couldn't see an escape. Then I heard wood creaking upstairs. He was coming down. My mind went on high alert, and I knew my only chance was to hide until I found an opportunity to escape. I ran to the pantry, a small room at the back of the kitchen, and closed the door behind me as quietly as possible. I crouched behind an old barrel and tried to control my breathing, which was now coming in short, desperate gasps. The sound of Uncle Michael's footsteps descending the stairs was like a death knell. He was coming down slowly, each step deliberate, as if savoring every moment. The creaking steps grew closer until I heard him enter the kitchen. There was a deadly silence. I forced myself not to breathe, not to move, to be invisible. Footsteps stopped for a moment, and I imagined him standing in the middle of the kitchen, listening, trying to sense my presence. The sound of my heartbeat was deafening. I knew that if he found the pantry door slightly ajar, it would be the end of me. For long seconds, he remained still. Then I heard a strange sound. It was a low, guttural laugh, almost inaudible, that slithered through the air like a venomous snake. My whole body trembled. Suddenly, a dull thud echoed through the house, followed by an even more oppressive silence. Uncle Michael's breathing stopped, and I knew he was listening, waiting for any movement. I didn't dare move a muscle. I felt sweat dripping down my face, and my body was stiff with fear. Then, as if deciding to toy with me, he started walking again. This time faster, more determined. Footsteps that echoed in my ears like a countdown to my death. He was close, and I knew that the only thing separating me from him, the fragile wooden door of the pantry. My desperation was absolute. If I didn't do something, it would be the end of me. My hands groped in the dark until I found something, anything I could use to defend myself. My fingers found the cold, rough handle of an old broom. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all I had. Then, the sound of the footsteps stopped again, this time right outside the pantry. I could feel his presence, just inches away from me. The sound of his heavy, irregular breathing invaded my ears like a deadly whisper. I knew he was listening, waiting for the slightest movement. I gripped the broom tightly, trying to control the trembling of my hands. The doorknob slowly turned. The pantry door opened with an agonizing creak. I was paralyzed, holding the broom as if it was the only thing keeping me anchored to reality. Time seemed to slow down as the kitchen light invaded the small space where I was hiding. My heart was about to explode, and every second felt like an eternity. Then, as if the universe was playing a cruel joke on me, a draft caused the door to open completely, revealing my trembling figure crouched in the corner of the pantry. Our eyes met. Uncle Michael stared at me with an expression that mixed surprise with something that looked like satisfaction. "Well, there you are," he said, his voice rough and soft, as if he had just found something he'd been waiting for a long time. There was no time left to think. In a desperate move, I lunged with the broom, trying to hit him, but he was quicker than I expected. In an instant, he grabbed the broom and yanked it from my hands, shoving me against the pantry wall. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I saw stars dancing before my eyes. "You shouldn't have messed with things that don't concern you, boy." Voice was cold, laced with a barely contained anger. He grabbed me by the collar and dragged me out of the pantry, tossing me onto the kitchen floor like I was a sack of trash. I tried to get up, but he kicked me in the stomach, forcing me to stay down. Pain was searing, and tears began to stream down my face. "You wanted to know my secrets?" he asked, his voice now tinged with insane joy. "Now you know." He knelt, grabbing me by the hair and yanking my head back, forcing me to look at him. His eyes were completely crazed, gleaming with a sick light. "But don't worry," he continued. "You won't need to keep this secret for long." Panic consumed me completely. I struggled, trying to escape, but he was too strong. He dragged me through the kitchen into the hallway, where I started screaming for help, for anything that could save me. But we were in the middle of nowhere. No one would hear me. He pulled me upstairs, back to the room where it all began. The same room where he kept his trophies, where he killed his victims. He threw me on the floor, and I felt the cold wood against my face. He shut the door with a bang, and I knew it was the end. "You know, I never planned for you to find out," he said, pacing around me like a predator about to strike. "But I guess deep down, I always knew this would happen. Family, right?" He laughed, an old, cutting laugh. I was out of strength, pain and terror consuming me. Then, when he knelt again, pulling something from his pocket, I saw the glint of a blade. My heart nearly stopped. He was going to kill me, just like he did with all the others. I closed my eyes, bracing for the worst. But instead of the fatal blow, I felt something strange. The sound of something breaking, like wood being crushed, and suddenly his weight was lifted off me. I opened my eyes just in time to see Uncle Michael collapsing to the floor, unconscious, while a figure moved behind him. It was my mom. She had shown up, armed with an old shovel she found in the garage, and hit my uncle with all the strength she had. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror and determination. She knelt beside me, pulling me into a desperate hug. "We're getting out of here," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Now." With her help, I managed to get up, and the two of us left that cursed room, running down the stairs as fast as we could. My mom was out of breath, but determined. We didn't say a word as we rushed through the house and out the back door, running toward the car. That night, as we left the farm behind, I couldn't think of anything but what had happened. The terror, the pain, the madness of my uncle. It all felt like a fever, a nightmare from which I was finally waking up. But even as the car sped down the deserted road, I knew those images, those memories, would never leave me. Uncle Michael survived the blow and was arrested later when my mom called the police. The farm was sealed off, and the authorities found all the secrets he had hidden for years. The news of the horrors he committed spread quickly, but the full details were never released to the public. The summer of 1999 ended, but the scars it left on me never did. Even now, all these years later, I still have nightmares about that house, about that chest, and about my uncle's insane smile. The end.